Spider-Man, the character who had just anchored the highest-grossing superhero film in history, was leaving the Marvel Cinematic Universe. On August 20th, 2019, a single report broke the internet, and it had nothing to do with a movie plot. No trailer, no teaser, just a boardroom disagreement over percentage points, and suddenly one of the most profitable partnerships in modern Hollywood was on the verge of falling apart. This is the story of how a fight over 5% of box office gross nearly changed the future of Spider-Man forever. To understand why this fight happened, you have to go back 2 decades earlier to a moment when Marvel wasn't the empire it is today. In 1999, Marvel was still recovering from bankruptcy. It had almost no leverage. So when Sony Pictures came knocking with an offer to license the film rights to Spider-Man, Marvel took the deal, a decision that on paper seemed reasonable at the time, and nobody could have predicted what that character would eventually become. For years, Sony built its own Spider-Man universe, separate from anything Marvel Studios was doing. Some of it worked, much of it didn't. Then, in 2015, everything changed. Marvel and Sony struck a new agreement. Spider-Man could finally join the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Sony kept ownership and distribution rights, but Marvel Studios, led by Kevin Feige, would help shape the character's story. The results were immediate: Homecoming, Far From Home, and eventually No Way Home, a film that would go on to become one of the highest-grossing movies ever made. It looked like the perfect partnership. But underneath, the terms of that deal were about to become a problem neither side could ignore forever. Here's the part most fans never saw: the actual math behind the 2015 deal. Under the original agreement, Disney and Marvel Studios received roughly 5% of the first dollar gross from Sony's Spider-Man films. For context, when Far From Home opened with $39, $2 million on a single day, Marvel's cut of that opening was just $1, $96 million. For a studio that had helped turn Spider-Man back into a billion-dollar franchise, 5% didn't reflect the value Marvel felt it was bringing to the table. Though Disney went back to the negotiating table and asked for something much bigger, a 50-50 co-financing arrangement. Disney would pay half the production budget for future Spider-Man films. In exchange, they wanted half the profits too. From Disney's side, this made sense. Their creative involvement had directly contributed to the character's massive comeback. But from Sony's side, this wasn't just a business proposal, it was a threat to their most valuable asset. Spider-Man wasn't just a character to Sony, it was, by a wide margin, their most profitable franchise. Handing over 50% of the profits on their biggest earner was a very different conversation than 5%. The two sides sat across the table and neither one was willing to move. And then, without warning, the story became public. On August 20th, Deadline broke the news: negotiations between Sony and Disney had collapsed. Spider-Man was out of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Kevin Feige, the architect behind the MCU's decade of success, would no longer be involved in future Spider-Man films. The internet reaction was immediate and enormous. Fans flooded social media in disbelief. Some blamed Disney for being too aggressive. Others blamed Sony for refusing to share. For a few days, it seemed like the unthinkable was actually happening. Tom Holland's Spider-Man, the version of the character fans had spent years falling in love with, would continue on, but completely disconnected from the universe that made him a global phenomenon. Industry analysts started asking the real question underneath the drama. Could Sony actually run Spider-Man without Marvel's involvement? Could they build a self-sustaining universe around him, spin-offs, side characters, a franchise machine without the studio that had engineered his comeback? And on the other side, could Marvel really afford to lose one of its most beloved characters indefinitely over a percentage dispute? Neither side had a clean answer. And for a moment, it looked like ego and leverage might win out over what was actually best for the franchise and for the fans who had shown up in the millions to watch these films. But here's where this story takes a turn that a lot of business disputes don't get. Just weeks after the news broke, both companies went quiet and then came back to the table. In late September 2019, Sony and Disney announced a new deal. Marvel Studios would return to produce one more Spider-Man film with Kevin Feige back as producer. The character would remain part of the MCU.
Tom Holland, people just
The terms
can't
of
get
that
enough
new
of the guy.
arrangement were never fully disclosed
I'm Peter, by the
publicly.
way.
Doctor Strange.
But industry
these are made-up
reporting at the
names.
time suggested a middle ground had been
I'm
reached,
Spider-Man.
something closer to Sony's original terms, with additional creative and financial concessions built in to keep both sides satisfied. What followed next silenced almost every doubt. Spider-Man: Far From Home sequel No Way Home, released in December 2021 and bringing together multiple generations of Spider-Man actors in a single film. It became not just Sony's highest-grossing movie of all time, but one of the highest-grossing films in movie history, period. The deal that almost fell apart over 5 percentage points ended up producing one of the most successful film releases either studio had ever seen. So what does this story actually tell us? At first glance, this appears to be a run-of-the-mill business dispute between two major companies clashing over money. Yet beneath the surface, it is a story about the fragility of partnerships, even the biggest and most successful ones in Hollywood. Spider-Man wasn't just a character caught in the middle. He was leverage. He was a bargaining chip in a much larger conversation about who gets to control value once something becomes bigger than anyone originally expected. Back in 1999, when Marvel sold those film rights, nobody at that negotiating table could have imagined Spider-Man would one day be worth billions of dollars, or that two entertainment giants would nearly go to war over a 5% difference 2 decades later. That's often the pattern behind these kinds of disputes. The original deal is struck when nobody fully understands what they're actually negotiating over. And when all parties finally realize that the character, franchise, or intellectual property, IP, had become an asset of incalculable value, the terms of the original agreement no longer reflected the actual situation. Sony and Disney eventually found their way back to the table because both sides had too much to lose by walking away. But for a few weeks in 2019, that outcome wasn't guaranteed at all. And here is something fans rarely think about when watching Spider-Man swing across the screen. Behind a franchise of this magnitude lies a story far removed from glamour, a tale of contracts, profit-sharing percentages, and boardroom meetings that determine the character's fate. The deal held. Spider-Man stayed. And No Way Home became proof that sometimes the fight over a franchise ends up making it stronger than it ever was before. But it's worth remembering for a few weeks in the summer of 2019, none of that was certain. If you'd like more stories like this about the real-life business battles behind Hollywood's biggest franchises, please subscribe to Frame and Fallout and let me know in the comments. Which franchise dispute should we cover next?